Today, we're going to dig into something really fascinating, how the writings of a scholar from way back in the 13th century connect directly to our modern laws of war. It's a connection you might not expect. So think about this for a second. Even in the middle of a war, are there rules? I mean, is there a line that just shouldn't be crossed? It's a huge paradox, right? And that question is exactly what we're going to unpack today. Okay, so here's what we've got on deck. We'll start with the modern idea of a rulebook for war, then we're going to jump back in time to see where these ideas came from. We'll get to know this incredible scholar, Al-Qurtubi, see how his thinking lines up with modern law, and then wrap up by talking about why all of this still matters so much today. All right, let's kick things off with something most of us can probably wrap our heads around. The whole idea that even in war, there are supposed to be rules. You know, most of us have heard of things like the Geneva Conventions, right? They're the rules that set limits on how wars are fought. But here's the thing, this idea isn't new at all. The desire to put some limits on conflict, to make it more humane, that's been around for a very, very long time. Now, to really get a handle on the ideas we're talking about today, we've got to understand where they came from. So let's take a trip back in time, all the way to 7th century Arabia, to see how this all started. And this brings us to a really key concept called asbabun nuzul. It's basically the science of figuring out why a certain verse of the Quran was revealed. What was happening at the time? What was the situation? For a lot of scholars, you just can't understand the text without understanding the context. So this leads us to a really pivotal moment in history, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The Prophet Muhammad and his followers had planned a peaceful pilgrimage to Mecca, but they were stopped. So they signed a peace treaty that said, okay, you can come back next year. But as that next year rolled around, people got nervous. They were worried the other side, the Quraysh tribe, would break the deal and attack them in a holy place during a holy month. It was in that super tense moment that the verses about fighting were revealed. So that raises the big question, right? How are you supposed to interpret verses that were revealed in a moment of crisis like that? Well, this is where our key figure comes in, the scholar who gave us one of the most lasting ethical frameworks for making sense of it all. His name was Imam Al-Qurtubi. He was a famous 13th century scholar from Cordova. And get this, we're talking 600 years after those events we just discussed. He's looking back at these verses, but he wasn't just looking at them as ancient history. Nope, he saw them as a source for timeless moral and legal principles. In this quote right here, it gets to the absolute heart of his interpretation. He's basically saying, look, the order to fight isn't a free-for-all. It's not a blank check for violence. It's a very specific, conditional response to being attacked. And even then, and this is huge, there are strict rules, like protecting people who aren't even fighting. So Al-Qurtubi boils all this down into 3 really clear principles. First, you only fight in self-defense when you're attacked. Second, your goal has to be about justice, like stopping oppression, not about aggression or greed. And third, and this is probably the most important one, you do not exceed the limit. So what does exceeding the limit actually mean? Well, it's a bunch of specific rules. No unnecessary violence. You do not kill non-combatants. We're talking women, children, and so on. It means you have to uphold the value of humanity and respect human rights, even when you're in a conflict. And really, the ultimate goal here isn't to conquer territory or get rich. Not at all. In this framework, the only valid reason for a defensive war is to end something called fitna. And that word covers a lot. It means persecution, oppression, basically anything that stops people from freely practicing their beliefs. Okay, so we've got this ethical framework that's, 800 years old. But what's absolutely wild is how similar these ideas are to the core principles of modern international law. The parallels are pretty shocking. I mean, just look at the comparison. Al-Qurtubi's idea of war as self-defense? That's right there in the UN Charter. His rule about not transgressing and protecting civilians? That is the absolute core of the Geneva Conventions. And respecting holy places? That lines up perfectly with the Hague Convention on protecting cultural property. It's incredible. All right, so this brings us to our final thought here. Why does an interpretation from the 13th century still feel so incredibly relevant today? How does this kind of wisdom last for so long? Okay, so let's quickly sum up the big takeaways. First, war is only okay as a last resort for self-defense. Second, context is everything when it comes to understanding scripture. Third, protecting civilians isn't just a suggestion, it's a non-negotiable ethical rule. And finally, the whole point is to get back to peace. You can see how this way of thinking really challenges those oversimplified and sometimes really dangerous views of Islamic teachings on war. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. In a world that's still struggling with so much conflict, can these ancient ethical ideas that are all about justice, restraint, and protecting human life, can they actually help us build a more peaceful future? It's something to chew on.